All right, guys, I don't know how you've done it, but you must still be alive on your Survivor pools. Up next, it's Scratchin' and Survivin'. All right, guys, we are still scratching and surviving. I am alive in that big pool that I was in, 8,000 people. Still got one entry alive and kicking. It's been double picks for the last 3 weeks, I believe, and it's double picks from this point out in that one. We're going to go over that in a bit. Most of you, if you're alive, obviously you're down to the nitty gritty in your pool. So we're starting to get to the point for almost everyone where we've really got to start taking the more chalky picks. I want to dive right into the Survivor grid. We're going to take a look at that. And then I got a spreadsheet for you guys that I want to show you just on how to calculate EV if you're unfamiliar with that. But first, I just want you guys to head over to the Sharp app, download it. There's a link down below, and take a look at what we got going on in the Sharp app. If you're into sports betting, anything like that, got some great tools. The app for, or the article on top props in the NBA, that's something that I do. Give out props every night in the NBA. It is up about, 130 units since we started it March last year, 18 plus, about 19 units so far in this season. So I highly recommend that. Check that out inside of the app. Of course, a lot of other good tools. And in the comments down below, I'm happy to answer any questions about that. And of course, your Survivor picks. Let's jump into the Survivor grid first. Then I want to go to that spreadsheet and just talk about expected value a little bit. All right. So here we've got this week for Survivor grid, and let's see if I have this sorted properly. All right, now I do. At least I have it sorted by the point spread, and you can look at EV. We talk about this a bit. I don't particularly like the EV at this point in the season because, and that's why I don't like the spreadsheet as much. And you guys who've been watching the show are familiar with my spreadsheet, because we're getting down to the end of the season here. And this EV calculation, while yes, it is important for this week, it doesn't really show the whole picture. And that's what my spreadsheet that I put together for you guys is going to be a little clearer about. Now, here's the pool that I'm in. I've crossed out the teams that I've taken. Last week, I was able to advance. I had Miami and the Jets and was able to fairly easily move on last week. Now, this week, I'm looking at the teams I could potentially take being Seattle, Tampa, Green Bay, Cleveland. Let's sort it by the actual point spread here, or even by win percentage, right? That's probably even better. And again, their win percentage is slightly off because they're not taking the midpoint. They're taking the actual line of the team. What I always recommend to you guys is take the midpoint of the lines. When you go in the Sharp app, take the midpoint of the two money lines. So in this case, Seattle's money line, the Rams money line, take the midpoint. And if you need to know how to do the calculation, just ask me down in the comments, and I'll do that calculation for you guys. But it's pretty simple calculation to figure out this percentage. So now that we've got the teams that are most likely to win, I can't take Dallas, I can't take Baltimore, but I can take Seattle, I can take Cleveland, I can take Tampa. So really, this is going to be, my decision is going to be in here: Seattle, Cleveland, Tampa, potentially Green Bay. We'll see how that line goes. Certainly, if Fields doesn't play, that will change it. And if it's Rodgers against no Fields, that might be my play. We'll see. But as of right now, these are really the three teams I'm looking at: Seattle, Cleveland, Tampa. Now, it makes sense if I was just looking at this week. Seattle, they're only getting 12.6% of the money. Seattle as an 8-point favorite looks like the obvious choice. Why are they only getting 12.6% of the money when Cleveland is a smaller favorite and they're getting a much larger chunk of the money, almost 3 times as much? Well, the reason is when we look to week 14, Carolina, or Seattle against Carolina, becomes one of the better picks that most people can make in their pools. Most people don't have Dallas, Buffalo, Kansas City, San Francisco. They're missing a lot of these teams, and Seattle would be the best possible team. I certainly can't, right? So if we look at my situation, if I go Seattle, Cleveland, I have to actually take an underdog next week. I would lose Seattle here. I'd be with Tennessee, and then I'd have to look at like Arizona against New England or Detroit against Minnesota. I'd be taking a dog if I took Seattle this week. So the logical choice here is for me to take Cleveland and then either the Tampa or Green Bay side. Again, as we talked about, that will depend a lot on who's starting here for Green Bay and Chicago. So let's go under the assumption that I'll be taking Tampa. Now, I want to show you guys how you could do that. That should be fairly obvious, right? But I want to show you guys the EV calculation because sometimes it's not quite as obvious. And there's a lot of math that goes into this, but there's a lot of art as well, right? I call it, there's a combination of science and art that go into most gambling, a lot of gambling, but particularly in pools like this, right? Because we don't have all the information available to us. Just like last week, we didn't know that Fields, if we were looking at this 2 weeks in advance, we didn't know that Fields wasn't going to play. The Jets wind up becoming a really good play. I had them available. If I was preparing for another team and I was saving teams for that week, they may not have been nearly as good a pick as the Jets were, and the Jets wound up being. The Jets wound up being the most picked team in that pool with the 2 entries, and I was in a great situation because only half the people were able to take Miami. They were the biggest favorite on the board. Only half the pool was able to take them. I was one of them. So the people who actually took Seattle last week were the big losers, and they probably had that Seattle game lined up for a few weeks. I don't trust the Jets. The Bears have been playing well, and then boom, you get that injury, and things change. So that's what you have to pay attention to. Again, similar situation with the Bears. We'll see how that plays out this week. But as of right now, I'm probably leaning here more towards the Tampa side. But I wanted to show you the spreadsheet. And for those interested, if you have any mathematical background at all, this really isn't that hard. You can set these up on a spreadsheet. Now, what I put in here is the win percentage of Seattle and Cleveland. Now, I'm taking this as my options this week are Seattle and Cleveland. It should be obvious to you as to why you would want Seattle because they're the best team here next week as well. And my drop off between Seattle next week and the next best team that I could take is far greater than the drop off between Seattle and Cleveland is this week. So that should be obvious, but I want to show you what the math is behind it. So here's my win percentage for both of these teams based on, and I just used Survivor Grid's win percentage. I didn't get too crazy with it. Now, how do you figure out if both teams are going to win? You simply multiply the win percentage of Seattle by the win percentage of Cleveland. That gives you 55.5% chance both teams win. Now, we assume that we're both going to advance. Let me clean this up a little bit. We assume that we'll both advance, or we definitely will both advance if both teams win. Here's the scenario where Seattle wins, Cleveland loses. There's a 19.7% chance. How do I figure that out? Well, we take Seattle, their win percentage of 75.2, and what is the probability Cleveland loses? That's 100% minus the 73.8%, right? So that's 1 minus B2 here, which is that Cleveland win percentage. And we multiply those two numbers, you get 19.7%. You do the same thing to figure out the Cleveland, except we're going to do the Cleveland win percentage, multiply it by the probability of Seattle losing. You get 18.3%. And then the probability of both losing, again, is just figuring out the probability of either of them losing, multiplying by both of those numbers by each other, and that gives you 6.5%. Now, when we add these all up, it should give us 100% because those are the only 4 scenarios. Tie, of course, is a possibility, but we're not going to add that in. It's such a small probability of a tie that we're not going to add that into our calculation. It's going to be somewhere in here. All right, so now if I pick Seattle and my opponent takes Cleveland, I didn't do this for when we both take Seattle or both take Cleveland because we're going to be in a situation where we're going to advance. And I'm doing this very simplistically as if there's only 2 people in the pool. Okay? How do we do the EV calculation? Now, I'm assuming here that $1,000 is going to be won. We're going to win $1,000 if we win this pool, and it costs us $10 to get in. Here's the calculation up here on how we figure that out. Now, what scenario do we win? Well, we took Seattle. My opponent took Cleveland. The only scenario we win is if Seattle wins at 19.7% and Cleveland, if Seattle wins at their 75.2% and Cleveland loses at this 26.2% number. You multiply those two numbers, you get the 19.7%. So 19.7% of the time in this scenario, I win $1,000. Okay? What's the percentage of times that I lose this pool? 18.3%. Where Cleveland's going to win, Seattle's going to lose. When I lose $10. So I take the probability of me winning multiplied by what I'm going to win, that's 1,000, and I subtract $10 multiplied by the probability of me losing, and I get $195.19 worth of equity, or that's my EV, just for this particular week. I do the same exact thing on the side. If I presume that I'm going to take Cleveland and my opponent takes Seattle, it actually drops my EV to 181.05 cents. So if we were looking at this in a bubble and this was the final week, there is no doubt that we would take Seattle. It's the much better EV play. And we don't have to do this whole big extensive calculation. All we have to do is know they have a better chance of winning. Therefore, they're the better play. But when I now add in the fact that Seattle next week is going to be a much better play than the rest of the teams I could potentially take, and let's just say Tennessee is the next best team out there. So if I didn't take Seattle, I'd be forced to take Tennessee. And my opponent, if my opponent went the route of going Cleveland, he would most likely take Tennessee, or she would take Tennessee. How would that play out? We would do the same thing. Both to win would be 46.08%. Seattle wins and Tennessee loses. Again, we would figure this out by the probability of Seattle winning. And I figured this out, guys, by just what the future line is on this game. So they're going to be about a 7-point favorite, which is in the 72% area as a 7-point favorite. And then Tennessee as a 3.5-point favorite. It's going to be about 64% to win as a 3.5-point favorite, somewhere in that area. And then we do the same calculations. We figure out what's the probability Seattle wins. We multiply that by the probability Tennessee loses. You get 25.9%. And then the same thing for the Tennessee side with Seattle losing. And you can see that differential here is 8% as opposed to the differential here being 1.4%. So just looking at that, we know that we're giving up a lot more here by taking Seattle early as opposed to waiting a week, right? And that's why most people are on Seattle. But just to extend this out again, based on the 1,000 number, what's my EV? Now, I added in what my probability is that we even get to this point, right? That's just an added step. You don't necessarily have to do that to figure out what the better play is. But I'm doing the same EV calculation, so I'm figuring out that $1,000 multiplied by Tennessee winning, because now I'm stuck with Tennessee. So I get $1,000 multiplied by the probability of Tennessee winning with a Seattle loss. And then I subtract out that $10 multiplied by the probability that I lose with my Tennessee bet and Seattle wins. And I'm taking about 62% of the time we'll actually get to this point. So now my EV here, if I go this route, is 109.49. When I add them up together, that's a 304.68. The reverse being I took Cleveland, then Seattle, and then I take Seattle, and my opponent did the opposite and has Cleveland. When we run those numbers, my EV jumps up to 159.58. I have $50 in EV to the positive here. I'm actually losing. I'm giving up about $14 in EV in this scenario, but I pick it up in week 2, or in our case, week 14. I pick up $50 in equity. You can see that differential here between the 340 and the 30, let's call it 305 and 341, is going to be about $36, right? So that's when I move this out 2 weeks, that gives me a better idea of what my equity is going to be. Now, this, again, was kind of an easy one to figure out on your own. You didn't have to, and that's why the bulk of the market is doing that. But you have to take into account, you're hoping that your opponent isn't that smart. One, maybe they're not looking at future numbers, and two, maybe they're just of the type. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't actually look at the point spread when they do this sort of thing, and they're looking at who they think is most likely to win. And for some reason, maybe they just don't like Cleveland, or they're just looking at it and saying, well, Seattle is the best team this week. I'm going to go with the best team and take my chances. Because that differential between the best team this week and the second best team is not nearly as great as the differential in what your two options would be next week, it makes for an easy decision. But sometimes it's not as easy to figure out, and then you might want to add in layers of adding in week 3 and week 4 and how the different scenarios play out if you want to geek out about this stuff. But again, when we get down to this point in these pools, what we're looking to do is maximize the potential for us to win. And there is game theory involved. There's a lot of math involved. But as I've told you before, we typically want to take the team with the most probability, the highest probability of winning, unless there's an opportunity cost there. And there's a cost in us doing that this week and taking Seattle if that was our play. If we had Seattle available to us, which most of you probably do. If you had Seattle available to you and you had Cleveland available, Cleveland's going to be the smarter pick just because you can take Tennessee now, or you can take Seattle the following week. Now, this is going to vary depending on your options. And if you're in a larger pool, Again, the larger pools are starting to look a lot more like smaller pools in the way I would go about them because you don't have as much time. We've only got a few weeks left in the season. I don't have as much future value. You're making the riskier picks early on in the season in large pools, and then as we get closer to the end, you get chalkier and chalkier, and now you're in essentially you become a player in a small pool. So you want to become chalkier and chalkier. I think this week it's going to be difficult for me to talk about exactly where you are in your pool, so that's why you need to comment down below. I'll help you out as the best I can. But I think Seattle's probably going to be a play, or Cleveland, I should say, is going to be a play for most people. You're going to want to hold off on Seattle if you have both of those. I think I just showed you mathematically why you'd want to do that. Again, we're not trying to pick the best team. I know we got Deshaun Watson coming back. There's questions about all that stuff. I rely on the fact that the market knows best. Is the market wrong? Of course the market is wrong, but the market is more right than any of you are ever going to be on your own, no matter how smart you think you are, no matter how smart I think I am. I've been able to beat the market by a very small fraction in my gambling career. That's been enough to make a profit, but not many people can actually do that, and the margins are so slim that I don't want to take that chance. I don't mind being totally wrong on a bet. You hate being totally wrong on a survivor pool. I'd rather just use the numbers and the spreads that the sports books are putting out there. That's incorporating all of the information possible out there, because especially in the NFL, the liquidity in that market is so great. It's very hard for you to outthink that market. So as always, look towards the point spreads. Hopefully you gained a little bit of information from there. I've got videos on EV and hedging. I was going to talk about hedging. Maybe we'll get into that more next week, and I've got some spreadsheets on that, on how you want to figure out your hedging. But do the same EV calculation that I just showed you, and then add into it. So losing, I'm going to give you the real brief, quick explanation without getting into it. You're going to have three scenarios, assuming we're taking a favorite. If you were hedging this week, Cleveland was your bet, and they're a 7.5-point favorite. Excuse me. You'd want to bet against them, right? That would be your hedge against the 7.5 points. So Cleveland's playing Houston. I forgot who they were playing there for a second. So let's say they're a 7-point favorite, and you want to hedge. So you're going to take the +7 with Houston. When you're doing your EV calculations, there's three scenarios now. The scenario is Cleveland's going to win their bet, or Cleveland's going to win the game outright and win the bet. That means they win by more than 7 points. Cleveland wins the game outright but loses the bet. That means they win the game by less than 7 points, or they lose the game totally. How do you figure out that calculation? Well, we know the probability of them losing the game totally, because that's the probability. That's 1 or 100% minus the probability that they win. That's the probability that they lose outright. What's the probability that they win and cover the spread? Well, spreads are about 50%. That's the whole point of the spread, is to put about a 50% probability on either side of that winning. So if we figure that 50% of the time they're going to cover the 7 points, that's easy. 50% of the time they cover. We know that the difference between them winning the game, the probability of them winning, and 100%, that's the probability that they lose. So I've got 50%. I've got that other number, the probability of them losing. It comes out to like 73, 74%. And then that differential is obviously the number where the Cleveland wins the game, but they don't cover. So it's going to be somewhere around 25, 26%. And then you just do your EV calculations the same exact way. You're going to multiply the probability that they win and that the my opponent loses their bet, right? What do I get there? I'm going to win $1,000, but I may lose the hedge bet, right? So I have to factor that in. So let's say I hedge for $250. Maybe I bet $275 to win $250. I'm going to do the $1,000 that I win in the pool. I lose my hedge bet because they won by more than the point spread. I know what that number is, and I do that calculation. That's going to be about 50% of the time, but then I have to figure in 50%, and then I multiply that by the probability that my opponent's team loses, right? Hopefully this makes a little sense. I'm going to get into it in more detail next week, right? So that would be the calculation. So what's the probability that I win my bet, or what's the probability that my team wins here, which would be Cleveland. They win the game outright, and Cleveland covers, which means I lose my hedge bet, and my opponent loses. Those three things. Figure all those things through those three out. You got to multiply each one of those to figure out what's the probability of that happening, and then multiply it by what my end result's going to be financially. I'm going to win $1,000, lose $275, and multiply it by that number. The next thing you would do is what's the probability Cleveland wins the game, and the bet wins. So I win my pool, let's say, because my opponent's going to lose their bet. So what's the probability that I win my bet, I win the pool because my opponent lost? So again, you do that calculation. It's going to be $1,000 plus $250 to win, and my opponent lost, whatever that calculation is. You come up with that number, and then you do that again for what's the calculation of them losing outright. I'm going to win my hedge bet. I'm going to lose the $10 that I put into my pool. And whatever the probability is that, you multiply that by that probability. You add all those numbers up, and that's your EV. Now, your EV is always going to be lower when you hedge than it is when you don't hedge, right? Because you're paying juice on every hedge bet. This is why I don't like hedging when we're making parlays. If I put a 5-team parlay in and I've got one leg left, well, everyone wants to hedge out of that. I hate doing that because why not just play the 4-team parlay, and it would have netted you more money than going and hedging out of that 5th one. I've got a whole video on hedging as well. You want to check out in the Sharp Academy, which you can find inside of the Sharp app. Check that out if you want to kind of geek out on some of these numbers. But I know a lot of you get into hedging. I don't like hedging for the most part, but I like it in this type of a pool because we're usually dealing with a small amount of money with a chance to win a large amount of money. It's not a situation we find ourselves in often, and I'm only paying juice on the hedge bet, but I'm willing to pay that juice in order to limit the variance that I have. When I'm playing parlays a lot, I don't have as much variance. I do have variance, but if I'm consistently playing parlays all the time, if you're a parlay player, all you're doing is giving away EV by every time you're waiting on one more leg of that parlay to hit, and you hedge it, you're giving away EV. All right, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent. We can get into all of those topics and more in the comments. As always, guys, good luck this week, and I'll see you next week with more, and we'll get into the hedging a little bit more. Good luck, guys.